Early on the evening of June 12, 2012, a 25-year-old woman named Noemi Belanger opened up the door to her hotel room on Phi Phi Island, which is a major tourist destination in Thailand. Once the door was unlocked, Noemi pushed it open and she held it for her little sister, 20-year-old Audrey, who came in wheeling all their suitcases. Noemi and Audrey were both from Quebec, Canada, and they were also both college students, and they were on this big month-long vacation to celebrate the end of the school year. They had been in Vietnam for the past 3 weeks, and today they had arrived in Thailand, and their plan was to stay here for a bit before finally heading back to Quebec. But for right now, Noemi in particular was feeling really exhausted. I mean, there was a lot of travel getting here today, and the past 3 weeks had been loads of travel, and Noemi was kind of hitting a wall. And so as soon as she got into the room, all she really wanted to do was just flop down on the bed and just lay there for a little while. But she had also become a fairly experienced traveler by this point, and she knew before she did that, she just wanted to make sure that, the bed was cleanly, make sure there were no bed bugs or, unclean sheets or something. And so she went over and pulled the sheets back and checked, and the sheets were pristine. It was beautiful. The room felt super nice. And so she just flopped down on the bed and just enjoyed the air conditioning. And at the same time that she was doing this, Audrey, who very likely was also feeling all the, the symptoms of travel over so many weeks. I mean, she likely was very, very tired. But she, instead of laying down, went right into the bathroom and started getting ready for the night. And Noemi sort of understood why. So while the girls were in Vietnam, they had met these two really nice guys who were from Brazil, and they had kind of hit it off, and they had left today to go to Thailand, and wouldn't you know it, it turned out those guys, their itinerary included them coming to Thailand today. And so it was kind of like this revelation at the end of their time in Vietnam that they would not have to say goodbye basically forever, but instead, the good times could keep on rolling in Thailand. And so the plan was that night they would meet up with these two guys, these Brazilian guys, out on the beach and basically party with them and just have a fun night. Now, Noemi was looking forward to this night out with these two guys, but she also had a little bit of apprehension about it. I mean, these guys were perfectly nice, and she and her sister had spent time with them in Vietnam, and really things had been fine. But, Noemi felt like Audrey was a little bit more naive and sort of like easier to be taken advantage of than she was. I mean, she was younger than her by 5 years, and also when the sisters had gone on this trip, their parents had been really apprehensive about, two young women traveling alone together all over the world. I mean, they were sort of vulnerable. And so the way Noemi had sort of played it to her parents is, don't worry, I'm the big sister. I'll keep my eye on Audrey. She'll be fine. And Audrey kind of played the role of younger sister and was like, yep, I'll do what my big sister says. And so Noemi sort of felt like she had a responsibility to keep Audrey safe. And so she was feeling a bit apprehensive about whatever they were going to do that night with these guys. It just sort of seemed like things were sort of moving quickly with these two guys. They should have maybe just stopped in Vietnam, but they're here. And so who knows what was going to happen. And so Noemi, as she's laying there and Audrey's getting ready, Noemi decides to just give her parents a call. Because one of the things Noemi had been doing over the past several weeks they'd been on this big vacation is sort of constantly updating her parents to assuage their concerns that anything was wrong, with their two kids. Noemi wanted her parents to see that she was doing everything she could, to keep her and her sister safe. And so she pulled out her phone and she was about to call her parents when suddenly Audrey appeared from the bathroom and said, stop. And she told her like, hey, remember, it's evening for us, but back home in Canada, it's the middle of the night. So you're gonna be waking them up and they're gonna have loads of questions like, why are you calling in the middle of the night? And probably you're gonna have to tell them about, how we're going out tonight with these two guys and they're gonna worry. Like, don't do that. Spare them. We will talk to them tomorrow. They don't need to know what we're doing tonight. Everything is fine. And Noemi was thinking, you know what? She's right. This is a bad time to call. Noemi actually forgot, the time change was so significant. And she also, wasn't sure what she would say to her parents about, going out with these two guys because it would raise some red flags. And so Noemi put her phone down and decided, you know what? Tonight's gonna be just fine. I just gotta let things go. And so she actually climbed off the bed and she joined her sister in the bathroom and began also getting ready for their big night out. A little bit later, Noemi and Audrey left their hotel room and they headed out to the beach. And sure enough, there, right outside of a beachfront bar, were the two Brazilian guys they were meeting up with that night. And as the two girls approached, they saw that each of these guys were holding these big buckets. They almost looked like, a toy that a child would use on the sand, to fill it up and make a sandcastle with, like a big, beach bucket. And, the girls, as they're walking over, they're wondering what these buckets were for. And they thought it was maybe like some joke these guys were going to play, or they didn't know what. But as they got closer, they realized that these buckets these guys were holding were filled to the brim with ice and liquid. There was some sort of drink in these buckets. And so the girls walked up to them and they said hello, and very quickly the conversation turned to these big drinks they were holding. And Noemi and Audrey were like, what are those? And the guys told them, these are like these amazing cocktails that you can only get in this part of the world. The girls asked, well, what is it? What's inside of the drink? What makes it so special? And the guys kind of looked at each other and laughed, and they're like, I don't know, just try it. It's really good. It'll make you feel great. Now, Noemi, being the sort of more responsible one, did not immediately begin drinking either of these drinks. Instead, she sort of paused and thought about it, but Audrey, on the other hand, was totally sold. She reached forward, grabbed one of the buckets, and just began chugging this drink. And so Noemi's looking at her like, come on, like you can't just jump into this. We don't know what this stuff is. But, after a couple of chugs, Audrey lowered the bucket and looked at her sister, and she just grinned, and she handed it back to her guy, and then she told Noemi, like, these taste great. This is awesome. Like, you gotta try it. Loosen up. And so at this point, Noemi, she's considering the situation. They were in Vietnam with these guys, and these guys were out partying with them. They were drinking with them, and, they seemed perfectly trustworthy, and they were clearly drinking from these buckets, and it didn't seem nefarious. And also, Noemi looked around the beach and suddenly realized that basically everybody had these big buckets. This was not just these two guys. Everybody's drinking this thing. And so Noemi's thinking, okay, well, if they think it's okay and it's sort of normal, in this part of the world, then it's got to be okay. And so she reached forward, grabbed the other bucket from the other guy, and took a big sip. Several hours later, well after the sun had gone down, Audrey and Noemi were having a great time with their Brazilian friends. They were still near this beachfront bar. They were actually dancing right outside of it because now there was a DJ blaring some music and there were all these people. And actually the sisters had sort of broken up and were sort of doing their own thing with their respective guy, but they were sort of near enough each other that they could kind of keep tabs on each other. And they were just having a great time. By this point, they had jumped in the ocean and gone swimming. They had eaten a ton of local food. And Noemi had lost count of how many of these big bucket drinks they had all consumed together. But they were really just having a blast. I mean, Noemi's vision was a bit blurry and she was kind of stumbling, and she'd look over at Audrey and she was kind of in the same state, as were the two guys they were with. I mean, they're buzzed. They're having a great time. And so the two girls and their guys are just out there dancing, doing their thing. It's about 1 a.m. at this point. And Noemi's guy says to her, hey, do you want to head back to the hotel room together? And Noemi's like, yeah, let's go back. But hold on, I want to talk to my sister first. And so Noemi kind of stumbles her way over to Audrey, who's in the middle of this big dance routine with her guy. And she stops Audrey and she whips around, and Audrey's all smiles too. And Noemi's like, hey, do you want to go back to the hotel room? We're going back now. Do you want to come? And Audrey's like, no, I want to stay here. I'm having too much fun. This is awesome. We're just going to keep on dancing. You guys should stay too. But Noemi was like, no, I got to go. We're going to go back. So you sure you want to stay? And Audrey was like, yeah, we'll stay. We'll see you at the hotel soon. Now, typically, Noemi and her sister really rarely separated, especially when they were out drinking and partying, because of all the inherent risks of being alone at night, potentially intoxicated. And so, this was kind of a rare thing for her to break away from her sister and separate. But it just seemed like this was okay. It was safe. And, these guys they were with, they really seemed like stand-up guys. And again, they were just having a blast here, and Noemi didn't really want to stop her from having a good time. And so ultimately, she did say bye to her sister and said she'd see her soon. Noemi turned, and with her guy, she headed back to the hotel, and Audrey kept on dancing with her guy in front of the beach bar. 3 days later, on the evening of June 15th, a member of the housekeeping staff at the hotel where Noemi and Audrey were staying walked up to the girls' room, and they knocked. And like it had been the past 2 days, they didn't get a response because over the past couple of days, the housekeeping staff had not seen anybody come in or out of this room. And now it had gotten to the point where they really had to get in there to clean the room. And basically, if they didn't get a response, this staff member was going to have to unlock the door and just go in there. And so one more time, they knocked on the door and called out, housekeeping, just in case somebody was in there. But again, there was silence. So the staff member put their card into the door, they unlocked it, they opened it up and stepped inside. And seconds later, that staff member was literally running out of the hotel room, screaming for help. At 9 p.m. that night, a team of police officers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Rat Somboon, arrived at the hotel room. Somboon was an experienced police officer, and he'd already been briefed on what was found inside the hotel room. So when he and his team walked inside and saw it for themselves, he wasn't shocked. When they got in there, they found two women inside. It was Noemi and Audrey Belanger. And both of them were lying in their respective beds, tucked up in their sheets, lying perfectly still, and each of them was completely surrounded by vomit. Somboon estimated that these two women had been dead for between 12 and 20 hours, and his first theory as to what might have killed them was alcohol poisoning. I mean, that would explain the vomit. This was also a big tourist destination, and clearly these people were tourists, and so maybe they were out partying and they died from alcohol poisoning. However, when Somboon looked more closely at the bodies, he noticed a confounding detail. There was all this dried blood on the girls' gums and also under their fingernails. And so that was not consistent with alcohol poisoning. And so Somboon thought, okay, well, maybe the reason they have blood in these parts of their body is because those are defensive injuries. Maybe somebody attacked these girls and that's how they've been killed. But after doing a cursory check around the hotel room, there was no sign of a struggle or any sort of break-in or anything like that. And so, if there had been some sort of lethal struggle in here, it certainly didn't show. And so Somboon and his team really didn't have any idea what had happened here. I mean, they had some ideas, but clearly they needed more information. Specifically, they needed to do an autopsy and a full toxicology report on both women. That would be the only way to really see what happened here. But that would take time. And so while they waited for those results to come in, Somboon decided that what he would focus on instead is trying to figure out what these girls were doing in the hours before they died. Where were they? What did they eat? What did they drink? And who were they with? Over the next couple of days, Somboon and his team interviewed several of the hotel staff. And from those interviews, they learned that Audrey and Noemi were visiting Thailand from Canada. And on the first night they were here, the two women went out early in the evening, and then one of them came back with some guy, some unidentified man, at 1 a.m. They came back to the hotel. And then at 4 a.m., the other girl came back to the hotel, also with an unidentified man. And so there are Noemi and Audrey and these two unidentified men that are in the hotel room, presumably, from 4 a.m. until 6 a.m., when both of these unidentified men left the hotel room together, and the two girls were presumably left inside the hotel room. Lieutenant Somboon reviewed some security footage from the hotel, which confirmed this entire timeline was correct, which meant Somboon really needed to speak to these two unidentified men because they clearly were the last ones to see these girls alive. And so the police department put out an announcement about Noemi and Audrey's deaths, as well as a public call for help in identifying these two unidentified men. And shortly after making this announcement, the police learned that these two men were Brazilian, and unfortunately, they had already left Thailand on their way back to Brazil. And so obviously Brazil is outside of his jurisdiction, and so he had to appeal to Interpol, which is an international police organization, and appeal to them to find these two Brazilian men and interview them. About a week later, Somboon finally got a call from Interpol. They had found these two men and they had interviewed them. And they told Somboon that when they informed these two guys that Noemi and Audrey had died, the two men seemed genuinely shocked. And then when they were asked, why were you so quickly on a flight out of Thailand back to Brazil? They said, no, there's nothing suspicious about it. We already had booked those tickets way in advance. We just got on the flight and left. There's nothing more to it. And so Interpol said they continued to press these guys and asked them, hey, you were the last ones who were with these girls before they died. Tell us about their condition. Tell us how you left them when you left the hotel at 6 a.m. And the two guys, they said, look, they did seem like maybe they were already hungover or sort of sick from, partying the night before. They definitely did seem a little bit down, but they were basically fine. However, Interpol said it was fairly interesting that the two men did admit that following, their night out with Noemi and Audrey, that the next 2 days, they were stuck in bed themselves, totally sick, vomiting, ill. They didn't know what from, but they said they were very, very sick following their encounter with these two girls. Somboon thanked the Interpol officer and then hung up. And even though Somboon couldn't help but feel still pretty suspicious of these two Brazilian guys, he now was thinking, okay, well, if they said they got really sick after, spending time with Noemi and Audrey, maybe what happened here is, all 4 of them got sick with something, some illness, and the guys survived it and the girls didn't. And so Sonbun began to think of, what type of illnesses could they have contracted? And the first thing that Sonbun began to think about that could have been an illness that all 4 of these tourists could have contracted was food poisoning. Tourists come to Thailand and try the local food, and sometimes it makes them really, really sick. In particular, there were 2 types of food in Thailand that were sort of notorious for giving tourists just the worst food poisoning. One of them was a particular type of mushroom, and another was blowfish. And these 2 items, if your body reacted badly enough to them, it could be lethal. However, when Sonbun got back the autopsy reports and the toxicology reports, he realized his theory about food poisoning was definitely wrong. So it would turn out those drinks that the girls had with the guys in those big buckets, they were unique to Thailand. Those are not drinks that are served really anywhere else in the world. And that's because those drinks are just not safe. And for whatever reason, it sort of blossomed in Thailand and it's sort of an accepted thing. But when you hear the ingredients of what's in this drink, you'll understand why it's not like a sanctioned or more popular thing outside of this small part of the world. So there is no alcohol in these big buckets of liquid. Instead, it includes crushed up narcotics, it includes cough syrup and Coca-Cola, and in some cases, pesticide. In fact, specifically DEET, which is the main ingredient in mosquito repellent. And wouldn't you know it, in the reports that Sonbun got back, he saw both of these girls clearly had ingested DEET, which again is a highly toxic chemical. However, despite learning this, even though this seemed to be clearly what happened here, this is a DEET poisoning case, Sonbun's thinking to himself, how could this have happened? I mean, these drinks, which are called 4x100s, are pretty popular in Thailand, and people are not just turning up dead left and right. It's a dangerous drink, no doubt, but people do not die with any regularity from drinking it. And so Sonbun thought, what must have happened here is whoever mixed this particular batch of 4x100s must have accidentally included too much DEET. And so that would explain how, the 2 girls died from DEET poisoning, too much DEET in their drinks, and that very likely the guys as well consumed the same batch, which had tons of DEET in it, but their bodies were able to withstand it and they survived it despite getting very, very sick. And so 9 days after the 2 girls had died, their bodies were sent from Thailand back to Canada, along with the Thai police's official findings that this was an accidental DEET poisoning. However, when Noemi and Audrey's remains arrived in Canada, they did not go straight to their family. Instead, they went to a leading coroner in Quebec whose name was Rene Roussel. So by this point, the girls' parents were obviously heartbroken, but more than that, they were furious. The way they found out about the deaths of their daughters was on the media. I mean, despite the fact that the police were immediately called when the girls were found dead, the Thai police did not get in touch with the family. They only got in touch after their investigation was done, and they're like, hey, by the way, your daughters are dead, and it was a DEET poisoning. It is what it is. Good luck. And so the parents felt like, are you kidding me? Like, you didn't loop us in at all? We're spending days trying to get in touch with our daughters, and you knew all along they were already dead? So the parents have no faith, no trust in the Thai police, and then to find out, wait a minute, so they drank this drink that apparently is sold at this beach bar all the time, and oh yeah, it killed them, no big deal. What, there's no warnings at this beach bar about how dangerous this drink is? Shouldn't there be like a tourist warning or something? And also, it's kind of a lazy explanation that, well, the 2 guys they were with drank the same poison, but they didn't die just 'cause, and our daughters did. That doesn't add up either. This whole thing feels like laziness, at best, or at worst, a cover-up. Maybe this looks really bad for Thailand that these tourists have died and it could have been prevented. And so the parents felt like, we can't just take their explanation at face value. Clearly, something is going on here. Something's wrong. And apparently, the Canadian government felt the same way as the parents. This case was all over the news. And they also felt like, wait a minute, guys, we haven't looked closely enough at this. What's really going on here? And so it was actually the Canadian government who told Rene Roussel to go ahead and do another autopsy on these girls' remains. Let's really see if it was DEET that killed them, or maybe if it was something else. And when Rene checked Noemi and Audrey's bodies, she did discover there was DEET in their system. However, not nearly enough to kill them. So while it seemed plainly obvious that yes, they must have consumed those 4x100 drinks, that couldn't have been the thing that actually killed them. However, Renee didn't find any other poisonous substances in these girls' bodies. Like, there wasn't another explanation. It just showed there was DEET, but that was basically it. And so Renee, she's thinking like there's gotta be some explanation here. And so Renee really began to do some serious research into this whole case, and eventually she found something. And it horrified her, it horrified the family, it horrified the world. It would turn out, from Renee Roussel's additional research, Noemi and Audrey were far from the first tourists to die this way in Thailand. Between 2009 and 2015, at least 20 tourists have been found dead under very similar circumstances. Now, Renee believed that what must have happened here is all these people, including Noemi and Audrey, must have been poisoned, but the common denominator did not appear to be food or drink. It had to be something else that was poisoning them. Something that was damaging blood vessels that would account for the blood under the fingernails and the gums, but also metabolized so quickly that after death, this particular poison could not be detected. And Renee figured out she was correct. So when Noemi and Audrey first arrived in Thailand, they went to their hotel room, and one of the first things that Noemi did is she pulled back her sheets to check for bed bugs. She wanted to make sure her bed was clean before she laid down and relaxed. And when she looked, it appeared clean. And it was because the sheets were clean. They had actually just been treated for bed bugs, so there were no bed bugs. However, the way this hotel and other hotels, not just in Thailand, but in other parts of the world, the way they were treating for bed bugs was by spraying the sheets with pesticide, specifically phosphine gas, which is highly toxic to bed bugs, so it gets rid of the bed bugs, but it's also highly toxic to people. For reference, it is illegal to do this. You're not allowed to spray sheets with pesticide. And so based on all the evidence, it's believed that what actually happened to Noemi, Audrey, and the two Brazilian men they were with is that they climbed into those beds on the night they came back, and the men were in there with them for some time, and all four of them were being exposed to this phosphine gas. It was going in through their skin, they were breathing it in, and they likely had no idea. And so they're getting sicker and sicker. And then finally, the two men, they get up out of the beds and they leave at 6 a.m. They've now been, totally contaminated by this poison, but not enough to kill them. So they go home, and over the next couple of days, they get really sick from their exposure to this gas. But Audrey and Noemi, they didn't leave their bed. They stayed in those beds all night. And unfortunately, as they laid there, their bodies continued soaking in all of this poison, and their bodies just could not handle it. And so it eventually killed them. But despite learning this, and despite the fact that clearly something illegal was done here, you cannot spray your bed sheets in a hotel with pesticide to get rid of the bed bugs. It's incredibly hazardous. You can't do it. Despite that, to this day, no one has been held accountable for these girls' deaths. On the morning of August 18th, 2018, a 41-year-old man named Vladimir Kostenko stepped out of a taxi onto a desolate road in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, miles and miles from civilization. All he had with him were his cell phone, a solar-powered charger for his phone, and a backpack that contained some clothes and 5 pounds of oatmeal. Vladimir bent down and leaned into the taxi to pay the taxi driver, and as he was doing that, the driver looked up at him and just said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And Vladimir just smiled and nodded and said, "Yep, I'm going to be just fine. Don't worry about me." Now, the taxi driver did not really buy this and just looked at Vladimir like he was completely insane. But Vladimir wasn't shocked. I mean, this is kind of how everybody reacted to him when he told them about this trip he was doing into the wilderness. When he had brought it up to his family the first time, they and all of their family friends had basically rallied together to try to stop Vladimir from going on this trip. It was way too dangerous. But Vladimir said, "Guys, I'm going. You can't stop me. I'm doing this. It's important to me." And at that point, when, the family and friends knew they couldn't change his mind, they shifted and said, well, at least, bring a gun or bear spray or something to protect yourself. But Vladimir also refused that too. He said, "Nope, I don't need any of that because the only thing I need is God. God is going to protect me." So Vladimir was extremely religious. He actually had left his home country, Russia, when he was in his early 20s because he was being persecuted for his Christian beliefs. And so now, in the United States, he lived out in Washington State and basically lived his life like a monk. I mean, he spent the majority of his time, basically praying and meditating and reading religious books, and he would often go on these multi-day long fasts. He did work part-time as a mechanic, but he rarely charged his clients when he did work. And then even when he did charge them, he was working so few hours that the money he was making was totally unsubstantial. But again, the way Vladimir looked at this is he didn't need money because ultimately God would take care of him. But despite all of his fasting and his praying and, his generosity, lately Vladimir had been feeling really lost. Like, he did feel deeply spiritual, but at the same time, he didn't really feel fulfilled. Like, he felt like he was missing purpose in his life, and it was really starting to bother him. And so it was around this time that Vladimir decided to go on this big trip. One of Vladimir's family friends was this guy named Dmitry Kudrin, and he owned this small cabin way out in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Now, Dmitry didn't use this cabin very much, but he kept it in great shape. It was fully furnished, there was a wood-burning stove inside, and the pantry was stocked with 3 years' supply of food. And so at some point, when Vladimir and Dmitry were talking, and Vladimir talked about feeling sort of lost and wanting to reconnect with his spirituality and find his purpose in life, well, at some point, Dmitry said, well, hey, if you want, you can go use my cabin and sort of disconnect from society and go retreat out there and sort of focus on yourself and sort of get right with the world. You're welcome to go out there anytime you want. You can stay out there as long as you want and for free, no problem. And Vladimir had happily accepted. And now here he was, standing on this desolate road in the Alaskan wilderness, watching as the taxi driver drove away. Except he wasn't even close to the cabin. I mean, he was in the middle of nowhere already, but he still had to go 14 more miles with no trail to make his way to this cabin. But Vladimir was so excited, he really felt like this was the thing he needed to figure out his purpose in life. And so he put his backpack on, took a deep breath, and began to hike. 3 months later, on November 3rd of 2018, Dmitry, Vladimir's friend who owned this cabin, found himself in his plane flying over the area roughly where his cabin was. And Dmitry was feeling very concerned. So obviously, Dmitry suggested Vladimir go out and use this cabin, and so he was totally open to the idea of it. But Dmitry had also told Vladimir that when he went out there, he really ought to bring a gun with him. Or if nothing else, at least some bear spray or something to protect himself, because this is truly the wild. You are not the top of the food chain anymore, and you want to be able to protect yourself. But Vladimir had said no, he would not be going with any sort of weaponry, that, God was going to look after him, and he'd be fine. And Dmitry's like, that's a bad plan, but he just could not convince Vladimir to change his mind. And so ultimately, Dmitry sort of regretted even suggesting this idea because he didn't expect Vladimir to go unarmed, but he felt like, it's already in motion. And so he told Vladimir, okay, fine, do your thing, but when you're out there, I need you to communicate with me regularly so I know you're okay. And Vladimir promised he would. And at first, that is exactly what happened. Vladimir, made the 14-mile hike from where he was dropped by the taxi. He got to the cabin, he got all set up. And then just about every other day or every few days, he would hike up this nearby mountain where there was cell phone service, and he would update Dmitry. He would tell him that things were going great. He was spending lots of time meditating and praying, and he was foraging for berries, and there was this pesky squirrel that kept coming in and stealing his food, so he was trying to figure out what to do with the squirrel, but clearly things were going fine, and Vladimir appeared to be safe. However, after 6 weeks of Vladimir being at this cabin, those pretty regular updates just abruptly stopped. Now, at first, Dmitry kind of chalked it up as like, well, I've been talking to him for weeks. There didn't appear to be any, burgeoning crises or anything going on in his life that might warrant some concern. He's a capable guy, maybe because it's the Alaskan winter and Alaskan winters are notoriously dark. There's not a lot of sunlight. Maybe his solar-powered charger isn't working. He can't get enough sunlight, so he can't charge his phone. And so maybe that's what it is. He just can't contact me because his phone doesn't turn on. Basically, Dmitry was coming up with these sort of rationales for why he wasn't hearing from his friend. But as the days went on and Dmitry still didn't hear from Vladimir, he couldn't help but start to feel like something's wrong here. And so finally, in early November, when Dmitri still had not heard from Vladimir, it's been about a month since those text messages stopped, Dmitri decided to get into his plane and fly out over the area where this cabin was and literally look down and see if his friend was down there in the cabin. Also, this gave Dmitri the opportunity to put some supplies on the plane in these big buckets that he could literally throw out down to Vladimir to also restock him. So Dmitri is now in his plane and he's circling around the area where his cabin is. But this cabin is really small and it's sort of in this big sea of trees. I mean, there's nothing else for miles. And so it's pretty difficult with the naked eye to actually look out and see his own cabin. But Dmitri had this camera on the underside of his plane that he could maneuver and look all around. And he had this screen that he could see from the cockpit that was basically an enhanced view of the ground down below. It was a lot easier to see, for example, his cabin. And so as he was circling, he's moving the camera around, and then bam, he sees right in the middle of his screen is his cabin. And there doesn't appear to be anything wrong with the cabin. You know, it all looks good. There's smoke coming up out of the chimney. And as he's circling, he's thinking, okay, Vladimir clearly is going to hear me. He's going to come outside and I'll see that he's okay. And sure enough, as he's circling around, Dmitri sees on his screen that the front door of the cabin opens and his friend Vladimir walks right outside onto the porch. He puts his hands on his hips and he looks up and he waves at Dmitri. And there's this moment of clear recognition, like obviously Vladimir knows this is Dmitri coming to check on him, and like, you know, Vladimir's down there kind of gesticulating that, hey, you know, everything's fine, I'm good, you know, sorry about the phone thing, or, you know, Dmitri didn't know what he was doing, but it just sort of seemed like, okay, there's recognition here, that it's been a month, but everything is fine. And so Dmitri got down nice and low and continued to circle, and on one of his passes over the cabin, he pulled a lever, dropped the supplies, those buckets of supplies, they landed down below, and then as Dmitri continued to circle, he watched on the camera as Vladimir walked up and put his hands on the supplies and waved again to Dmitri, sort of signaling, you know, thank you for the supplies. And at that point, Dmitri's thinking, okay, Vladimir's just fine. Everything's good. I can go home. And so that's what he did. Now, he would have landed and gone and seen Vladimir up close, but, you know, there wasn't anywhere to land anywhere nearby. Like, this was the closest he could get to Vladimir, and so he decided this was enough. So Dmitri, he turned around and he headed home. But about 2 months later, on December 23rd, Dmitri was once again in his plane flying over the area where his cabin was. Because over these last 2 months, he continued not to get any text messages or any communication from Vladimir, which, you know, that was bad. He sort of expected that, given that Dmitri flew out there before and they clearly recognized, like, hey, you know, are you good? There was sort of a moment of recognition that Dmitri's checking in on Vladimir because of the silence. That's what Dmitri's thinking. Maybe that would inspire Vladimir to find a way to send out communications now, like let Dmitri know he's okay. But he hadn't for 2 months. And so Dmitri's thinking, okay, that's bad. Also, it's now December. And the winter in Alaska is full bore. I mean, tons of snow on the ground. It's frigid temperatures. It is truly brutal winter conditions. And then lastly, there had also just been this major earthquake in the area where Dmitri's cabin was. And so all those things combined made Dmitri think, okay, I better get out there and just check on Vladimir again. And so once again, Dmitri is circling low over the area where his cabin is. He's got his camera trained towards the ground and he's moving it around as he's circling, and eventually he finds his cabin. And his cabin is clearly in one piece. So the earthquake did not destroy his cabin, but there's no sign of Vladimir anywhere. But then again, like, you know, this is just the first second he's seen the cabin. He's only been in the area for a couple of minutes now. Maybe Vladimir has not heard the plane yet. And so, you know, Dmitri's not lost hope. And he continues to circle. And as he's circling, he drops these supply buckets that land right out in front of the cabin. And at this point, Dmitri's thinking, okay, that's pretty noisy, having these supply buckets smash into the ground outside. Certainly now Vladimir is going to come outside to see what's going on. I mean, there's not much else happening. This clearly is something that would draw his attention, but no, nobody comes out of the cabin. And so at this point, Dmitri gets as low as he possibly can, and he's got his camera trained right at the cabin, and as he's doing another pass, he realizes something. There's no smoke coming out of the chimney. In fact, the top of the chimney is covered with snow, which means clearly no fire has been lit, at least not recently. And so Dmitri starts to panic. Like, if anybody was in that cabin right now without a fire lit, it would be so cold, they would likely freeze to death really quickly. Like, this is a crisis. What's going on with Vladimir? But Dmitri couldn't land anywhere nearby. Like, there was no way for him to really get down to this cabin. So he had to fly all the way to the nearest airport, and then once he touched down, he immediately contacted Alaska State Troopers to report his friend missing, because that was the only thing he could think to do. However, after Dmitri made this report, the state troopers didn't launch some huge search for Vladimir. And that's in part because they weren't actually sure he was missing. They understood that Dmitri, after flying out over the area, had seen snow on the chimney cap, and, it's really cold out, like nobody could survive without a fire. And also, he flew over the area, dropped supplies, and Vladimir didn't come out of the cabin. How could he not hear that stuff? They understood that. But they're also thinking, like, it's possible Vladimir just might not have been in the area. Maybe he was out hunting or, foraging for food or whatever he was doing, and maybe he just wasn't in the area. And that's why it gave you the impression that he was missing. And so that was one part of it. And the other part is the weather was atrocious in this part of the world. And so just sending out a search party into the terrible weather out into the wilderness was really risky. And so the troopers thought it just wasn't worth doing this big search. And so instead of launching a big search, the troopers told Dmitri that what they were going to do instead is just comb through airline records, local airline records, to see if maybe a Vladimir Kostenko had, taken off and flown out of the area. Maybe he didn't tell Dmitri and he just left. Maybe that's why he's not there. And this really frustrated Dmitri and the rest of Vladimir's family, because they're all looking at this as a true emergency. And they're thinking, there's no way he just hopped on a plane and flew out of here without telling anyone. And so finally, 3 days after filing this missing person report, Dmitri said, enough is enough. I'm gonna just take it into my own hands and go out there myself and see what's going on with Vladimir. So he chartered a private helicopter and he flew out to the cabin. And when he got there, he gets off the helicopter and he just scans the property. And he sees, this little cabin, and there's, firewood outside stacked up with snow all over it. There's loads of snow on the cabin, and there's snow kind of drifted up on the front door, making it seem like nobody's come in or out of this cabin for some time. And, Dmitri, he's looking around for Vladimir, but there's no sign of life anywhere. Dmitri calls out for Vladimir, but there's no response. And so, with some level of trepidation, Dmitri begins walking up towards his cabin. And when he gets close enough to the front door, he notices something weird. He sees that the front door of this cabin has clearly been boarded up from the outside. There's this big piece of metal that's been placed, basically blocking the door, so nobody could go inside of it. And so Dmitri's thinking, like, why would you do this unless you were leaving the cabin? But why would Vladimir leave the cabin? Like, where is he? I don't understand what's going on here. And so Dmitri goes up to this piece of metal and pries it off the front door, and then he swings open the front door and he looks inside, and everything is pristine. Vladimir is not inside, but the cabin looks immaculate. There's still firewood, there's still food, there's no sign of chaos, no sign of any struggle whatsoever, like everything looks exactly like it should. And so Dmitri, he began walking around inside of this cabin, looking for any clue as to what happened to Vladimir. But there was nothing. Until he got to the firewood. He noticed that clearly Vladimir had been labeling his firewood. There was one piece of firewood in particular where the writing was very clear, and what it said was, frankincense aroma, do not burn. And so Dmitri's looking at this piece of wood, that's been labeled as something that he shouldn't be burning, and he's looking at other pieces of wood that also have some level of labeling on them, and he's thinking, like, what does that mean? I don't understand that at all. But that was it. There was no other clues about where Vladimir had gone. And even the labeling of the wood, like, that didn't give him anything. And so the impression that Dmitri got after seeing this firsthand was that at some point, Vladimir, for reasons completely unknown, just decided to board up the cabin and disappear into the Alaskan wilderness with basically no protection, no clear sign he even brought food with him. He just got up and left. Friends and family, and even some authorities, believe there is a chance he could still be out there somewhere. In fact, at one point, authorities thought they had found Vladimir in Hawaii. It turned out not to be him. And then again, they thought they found him in Oregon. It turned out not to be him as well. But the case is still open, and authorities think, at least some do, that he might be alive somewhere. But nobody knows where. And so at this point, all the family has to go off of is the final image of Vladimir, which was taken from inside of Dmitri's plane when he did that first flyover, and he saw Vladimir come out on the porch. That is the final image of Vladimir that we know of. We don't know what happened after this image. All we know is, at some point he began labeling his firewood, writing down which aroma the wood makes, and then he boarded his place up and he left. But where he went next is still a mystery. On August 4th, 2019, a 28-year-old man named Sombora left his farm in rural Cambodia and headed off into the jungle. His goal that day was to climb the nearby Chakrai mountain and try to harvest as much bat guano as possible. So bat guano is bat poop, and it makes excellent fertilizer. And in the jungles of Cambodia, there are all these mountains, including Chakrai Mountain, that have these cave systems full of bats. So it's a great place to go looking for bat guano. And Sum and his family, they would go out there and harvest as much as they could in order to support their farm. This is kind of like their main business. And so on this particular day, Sum was not just going to climb this mountain and go into random caves and hope for the best. Today, his mission was to go to one cave in particular that he knew had a ton of bat guano inside of it, mostly because the other people in the area that went out harvesting bat guano, they wouldn't go into this cave. And the reason for that is the cave was really, really narrow and tight and frankly dangerous because of it. And so they didn't go into it. But Sum was a very slight guy with a narrow frame. And so he could basically get himself into tight spaces and reap the benefits of places like this cave. And so after hiking for about an hour through the jungle and then up this mountain, Sum finally reached the entrance to this particular cave. And it was an opening that was about 3 feet by 3 feet, and you really couldn't see very far into it. But Sum knew what he was doing, and pretty much immediately got down on his stomach. He got his flashlight out, he took his guano bag, which had a long strap coming off of it so he could drag it behind him, and he began wriggling his way into this opening. Now, the way this cave system roughly worked is there was this narrow entrance that went kind of straight ahead like a tunnel, and then periodically, as it continued along, there'd be these kind of like pockets, these openings where it would get big enough where Sum could actually get up onto his hands and knees and kind of move around a little bit. And it was inside of these pockets, these caverns, where all the bats would be. And that's where most of their poop was. And so all Sum was trying to do as soon as he went inside this cave is get to these caverns and then do his harvesting. And so Sum, he wriggled his way forward. He got through that first tunnel section and he entered the first cavern. And sure enough, there were quite a few bats on the ceiling and there was all this bat guano, about a pound of bat guano. And so he scooped it all up, he put it into his bag, and then he kept on moving through the tunnel into the next cavern. And as he was making his way down that second stretch of tunnel, shining his light ahead, he saw what looked like the walls moving up ahead when he was looking into the next cavern. But he knew that was not actually the wall moving. It was a whole bunch of bats in this next cavern. And so from his perspective, it seemed like there were way more bats in that cavern than this one. And so in theory, this next cavern was going to have a ton of bat guano. Potentially all he would need for this entire journey. He could just pack his bag and leave after this next cavern. However, there was a small problem. Now, Sum had come to this spot many times before, and he knew that going from the first cavern to the next cavern had a little bit of a hiccup. On the ground, as you crossed the threshold into this second cavern, was a crack in the ground that basically ran perpendicular to the way this tunnel ran. Now, the crack was only about 6 inches wide, but when you were over it shining a light down into this crack, it was like it went on forever. It was like this unending hole in the earth. And so Sum always just got creeped out climbing over this crack because there was really no way to go around it. You really had to go right over the top of it because all he was thinking about is like, what's down inside of this deep hole in this cave? It's reminiscent of how people are scared of really deep oceans, like thalassophobia. It's fear of what's down there. And so Sum just really didn't like it. But again, he knew there was going to be a ton of bat poop if he could just cross over that crack, and so it was worth it. And so Sum, he wriggled his way through the tunnel, he reached the crack, he kind of shined his light down and again saw just this never-ending pit that just shot straight down into the earth. But Sum took a deep breath, and he wriggled over the top of it successfully, and after he crossed it and he was about to enter into the cavern to get this huge bat guano payload, he felt something tugging on him, and immediately he was terrified and he whipped his head around wondering what could possibly be grabbing him. When he realized nothing was grabbing him, it was his guano bag that he dragged behind him with that big strap. It had gotten stuck on the crack itself. Sum was immediately relieved because he had really hyped up the idea that maybe there was some monster behind him or something, but there wasn't, and so he just kind of grabbed his strap and kind of jimmied the bag out of the crack.
But as he did, he lost his flashlight. So he's moving the bag and he kind of fumbles the flashlight, and the flashlight rolled backwards into the crack. And as soon as this happens, Sum is watching with horror as he's seeing the light kind of jostling around as it tumbles down into the crack. But then it comes to a stop. Like, it didn't just fall endlessly into the earth, it got wedged at some point, and the light from the flashlight was actually shining straight up. So it was pretty near the surface. And so Sum's thinking to himself, okay, that's bad. I can't lose my flashlight. I have to be able to see to get the bat poop and to get out of here. But let me just turn around and I'll reach into that horrible crack and I'll get my flashlight and everything will be okay. And so Sum carefully backed back down across the crack. And when he was looking straight down into the crack, he could see the flashlight, and it was wedged, pointing straight up, maybe 1.5 feet or 2 feet down. Now, Sum did not want to reach his arm into this crack for all the reasons he was scared of the crack. Like, he doesn't know what's down there, but he really needs his flashlight. And so Sum kind of backed himself up and mentally prepared himself, and then reached into the crack and began blindly reaching down, hoping to grab this flashlight and yank it out as fast as he could. But as he reached, he couldn't quite get to the flashlight. And so he began turning and twisting his body and forcing his shoulder deeper and deeper until finally he could touch the flashlight. And then finally, right as he grabbed the flashlight, something happened. That night, Sum did not return to his farm. Now, his family was not actually that worried about it because it was not uncommon for Sum to go out on these guano foraging adventures and be gone for, a couple days at a time. However, after another 2 days went by and still Sum had not returned, his family started to get worried. And so ultimately, Sum's brother decided to go out and look for him. Sum's brother had often collected guano with Sum in the past, and so he knew roughly where Sum liked to go, including Sum's favorite spot, that cave up in the mountain. And so when the brother went out looking for him, pretty quickly he found himself in that favorite spot. Now, Sum's brother was about the same size as Sum, and so he too could navigate this very tight tunnel. And so that's what he did. He got down on his stomach, he had his flashlight out, and he yelled into the cave for Sum, but there was no answer. And so he eventually made his way to that first cavern. He didn't find Sum. He kept going, and right as he was about to hit that second cavern, as he shined his light ahead, he saw there was a bag on the ground, and it was his brother's guano bag. And so he knew his brother had to have come here, and he began yelling out for his brother, but there was no answer. And then right as the brother paused for a second just to listen, he heard a faint cry, a human cry. And he called out, like, "Is that you, Sum?" And again, he heard another cry. But he's looking around and he can't see Sum anywhere. And so the brother just continues shimmying his way towards that second cavern. And right as he begins to cross over that crack, he hears the cry again, and it's coming from right below him. It's coming from the crack. And the brother takes his flashlight and shines it straight down into that crack. And there, in the crack, was Sum. He was wedged all the way inside of the crack. It would turn out, a few days earlier, when Sum was in this cave reaching for his flashlight, he couldn't quite get his fingers around the flashlight. And so he kept turning his body more and more until his body was parallel with the crack itself. And then finally, right as he's leaning down and he gets his hands on the flashlight, he rolled and fell into the crack. His whole body basically perfectly fit into the crack, and down he went several feet where he wedged into the crack. And then once he was wedged down there was nowhere to go. He was absolutely trapped. And so Sum laid in this crack for days, having no expectation he was going to get out. He was totally wedged, no food, no water. He was going to die, and he knew it. In fact, he actively wished he had a knife on hand so he could take his own life. But luckily for Sum, his brother would find him, his brother would go and get help, and on the 4th day of Sum being trapped inside of this crack, rescuers were able to pull him out, and he would make a full recovery.
At 7 p.m. on October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentik flew his small plane over a body of water just south of Australia called the Bass Strait. He'd just taken off from Melbourne, Australia, and his flight plan was to go 60 miles south to an island called King Island. And he was really excited about this flight. Not so much about where he was going, but because this represented the first time he'd actually be flying by himself at night. So Frederick had always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but the journey to actually becoming one had been really difficult. He had applied twice, actually, to the Royal Australian Air Force, but Unfortunately, he could not meet their requirements, and then also he had tried to become a commercial airline pilot, but he had failed their tests. But luckily for Frederick, his father had a ton of money, and he ultimately swooped in and funded Frederick to take some private lessons, and through that, he was able to ultimately pass the tests and get his pilot's license. And so, as Frederick coasted along, looking down below at the lights of Melbourne disappearing behind him, he felt like he was on top of the world. He was doing the one thing he had always dreamed of, and he was so happy, and it was so cool to be doing it at night by himself. And so he was just looking out at the sights and looking ahead at the Bass Strait, which is this huge, dark expanse of water. And it was like everything was right in the world. He was doing exactly what he wanted to do. However, only a few minutes into this flight, at 7:06 p.m., something strange happened. As Frederick was flying along, he suddenly became aware of a light coming from somewhere behind him. Remember, it's nighttime, so it's totally dark where he is, and he's flying over a body of water, so he's kind of like in this void of darkness. And so any lights are really going to illuminate the cockpit. And so he sees this light, he turns around, and maybe 3,000 or 4,000 feet behind him, he sees what looks like a plane. That is the source of the light. And right away, Frederick's thinking that is both surprising and also potentially very problematic, because he knew from his training that that was far too close to be to another plane. And so the only explanation was either that pilot was off course or Frederick was off course. And Frederick's thinking, if I'm off course here and I'm flying where I shouldn't be, I'm going to get in trouble with air traffic control and I might lose my pilot's license. Like the one thing I covet, I might lose it. And so initially, Frederick really didn't know what to do. He was sort of panicking and just kind of frozen, like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do right now. And as this was happening, Frederick kept instinctively looking back at this light, trying to figure out what this plane was doing. And every time he would turn around over the course of just a few seconds, it was very obvious that this light, this other plane, was gaining on him. And so Frederick starts to worry, like, this is not just about maybe getting in trouble or not. This plane might crash into me. Look how fast they're going. Like, what do I do? And so Frederick, at this point, he double-checked that he was on course, and based on his instruments and what he had been doing, he really felt like he was on course here. And he just thinks, you know what, the best thing I can do here is just call air traffic control. So he grabs the radio and he gets a hold of Melbourne Air Traffic Control and he says, hey, there's this plane that is like right behind me. They're gaining on me. I'm worried they're going to crash into me. Do I need to deviate? Like, what's going on here? And the air traffic controller very calmly says, okay, let me check the radar. Let me check the schedules. And so Frederick, the whole time he's waiting for a response, he's looking over his shoulder and still this light is gaining on him. It's getting closer and closer. And then finally, the controller gets back on the radio and they tell Frederick, there is no other aircraft anywhere near you. Like, there's nothing over the Bass Strait. You are completely alone. But Frederick couldn't believe this because by now, the light, the aircraft that was right behind him, has gotten right behind his. It's basically right on his tail. And Frederick is now completely panicked and he's getting ready to try to explain, like, no, wait a minute, like, there's gotta be a better explanation here. There's something right here. But at that very moment, it becomes very clear to Frederick that this is not some ordinary aircraft, because it began doing something when it got right up behind his aircraft that no normal aircraft could do. This light suddenly began orbiting Frederick's aircraft. Frederick is traveling forward, and this ball of light is basically whipping around his aircraft as fast as can be. He can barely make it out. He's starting to panic, and at the same time, Frederick begins to hear the sound of his engine starting to fail. And there was no reason for it. His craft was fine when he took off, but now it's clearly sputtering and failing. And so all Frederick could do in this totally intense, panicked moment is just grab the radio and begin talking to air traffic control about what he was seeing. The person Frederick actually spoke to on the ground in this moment was an air traffic controller in Melbourne named Steve Roby. And Frederick would come off to Steve like he was totally crazy and unhinged, and Steve would say that he couldn't really understand what he was talking about. But at some point, Frederick clearly began talking about some sort of craft orbiting his own, and that his engine was starting to fail and he didn't know what was going to happen and he couldn't make an emergency landing. He was over water. And then suddenly Steve remembers hearing this grinding metallic sound come over the radio that basically washed out whatever Frederick was saying. And then it just goes deadly silent. And after that, Frederick disappeared.
They searched the area where they knew he was before he disappeared, but they never found his plane. There was no sign of a crash. He never landed at King Island or went back to Melbourne. He was just gone. All they have is that final recording of him describing something orbiting him, then this grinding metallic sound, and then silence. And recently, that audio recording was made public. Now, before I actually play a clip from that audio, here's the official explanation for what happened to Frederick. As he was flying over the Bass Strait, it was so dark and there were no lights really anywhere that at some point, because he's an inexperienced pilot, I suppose, he flipped his plane upside down without realizing it, and the light that he was seeing was actually just a reflection off the water below of his own plane. And eventually, from flying upside down, his engine began to fail, and he crashed into the Bass Strait. However, not everybody believes this explanation, because one, it seems sort of preposterous to imagine that Frederick would not have realized he had flipped the plane upside down and was flying for so long inverted. Like, how could you not notice that? And two, this would not be the first time that somebody reported unexplained phenomena over the Bass Strait. In fact, over the years leading up to this incident with Frederick, there had been so many reports of UFOs flying over the Bass Strait and also unexplained disappearances that they've dubbed the Bass Strait the Bass Strait Triangle, after the Bermuda Triangle. Basically, it's a part of the world where a disproportionate number of unexplained phenomena occur. And so to this day, Frederick's disappearance remains a mystery. All we have is his final call for help.
Delta Sierra Juliet, what type of aircraft is it? That was deleted from the press accounts for some reason. Delta Sierra Juliet, and confirm you cannot identify the aircraft. Delta Sierra Juliet, roger. Stand by. Can you describe the aircraft? Delta Sierra Juliet, roger. How large would the object be? Delta Sierra Juliet. Delta Sierra Juliet, confirm the aircraft just vanished. Delta Sierra Juliet, is the aircraft still with you? Delta Sierra Juliet, roger. What are your intentions?
My intentions are to go to King Island, Melbourne. The aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft. Delta Sierra Juliet, Melbourne.
On the evening of February 1st, 2009, a 32-year-old man named Luo Jinfa stood in the doorway of his apartment in Taiwan, waiting for his landlord to finish lecturing him about being late on his rent. Luo had just moved into this apartment 2 months earlier in December. And this was not a very nice apartment. It was a cramped downstairs unit with no air conditioning, so it was really sweaty and awful in there most of the time. But it was all Luo could afford. He wasn't working right now and knew this was the best he was going to get. As the landlord continued to berate Luo about how he was totally within his rights to evict Luo if he didn't pay him, how he'd already given Luo an extension, and what's going on here, you got to get your act together. As all that was happening, Luo just was totally quiet and just was waiting for the landlord to be quiet. Because at this point, Luo didn't really care about the rent side of this discussion. He just wanted his landlord to be quiet so he could ask him a very strange but important question. And finally, after about 5 minutes of the landlord just ranting, the landlord stopped for a second to try to calculate how much interest he could potentially charge Luo. And as the landlord began scribbling notes on his notepad, Luo saw his opportunity. And he said, "Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but I actually need to ask you something." And the landlord was sort of caught off guard by the way Luo was approaching him. The landlord thought he was intimidating Luo, so the idea that Luo was now gonna, interrupt him and go a different direction with this conversation felt sort of disrespectful. But the landlord looked at Luo like, what question could you possibly have? And Luo just said, do you know if anyone's been murdered inside of my apartment? After Luo asked the question, the landlord just stared at Luo, like he didn't really know how to process this question at all. But then after a moment, this look of shock disappeared, and once again, the landlord was just annoyed with Luo and said, "You know what? I know what's wrong with you, but I'll be back in a month and you better have your rent." And then the landlord just turned around and walked away without answering Luo's question. Now, Luo was pretty stressed out about paying the rent. I mean, he had no money and had no idea how he was going to pay his landlord in a month. But the much more pressing issue in Luo's life were the very strange things happening inside of his apartment, which is what prompted him to ask that strange question to his landlord. And so not getting an answer to that question just made this whole situation that much more stressful for Luo. And so after the landlord disappeared down the hall, Luo kind of hesitantly turned back around and went back inside his apartment and shut the door, and immediately he just felt terrified. 1 month later, on March 2nd, 2009, a day after the rent was due, Luo's landlord had still not received rent from Luo, and so he spent that entire day, March 2nd, calling Luo, trying to get him on the phone to be like, "Where's my money?" But Luo wasn't answering his phone, and so eventually the landlord went to Luo's apartment and knocked on the door. Eventually, when Luo didn't come to the door, the landlord just used his own key to let himself in. Now, the landlord didn't really know what to expect when he walked inside of Luo's apartment. All he knew was that Luo was kind of a weird guy, and he certainly wasn't paying rent, and his general impression of Luo was definitely a bad one, and so he kind of expected the apartment to reflect the negative things he thought about Luo. But when he stepped in there, even the landlord was shocked at what he saw. I mean, the apartment was in total disarray. Furniture was all over the place and stacked up against the walls in weird arrangements, and there were all these bottles of empty alcohol all over the place. There was a freezer that Luo had moved to the middle of the living room floor. I mean, the place just was a total mess and just kind of all over the place. But the thing that really creeped the landlord out the second he walked in there was that all over the walls were these yellow and red pieces of paper with prayers written on them that had been stabbed into the wall with individual knives. Like Luo had taken a prayer and stabbed it to the wall over and over and over again, all over the apartment. Now, the landlord had no idea what to make of any of this. He just knew he was done with Luo. He was evicting him. And so he quickly searched the apartment just to make sure Luo was not really in here. And he wasn't. The apartment was empty. And so after that, the landlord just left the apartment. He locked the apartment. He went and got a new lock at the hardware store, came back, replaced the lock, and was determined to never let Luo ever come back. And in fact, Luo would not come back. The landlord never had to worry about, telling Luo to stay away. He just never came back. And for months, Luo's old apartment just sat empty. Fast forward 7 months after the landlord went inside of Luo's apartment, and the landlord's brother approached the landlord and said, "Hey, can I rent out that apartment? No one's using it." And the landlord said that was fine, but the brother would have to clean up the apartment because nobody had touched it since Luo had lived there. So a couple of days later, on October 18th, the landlord's brother, along with the landlord, met at Luo's apartment. They went inside and they totally cleaned it out. Basically, all the furniture and the lamps and everything in there, some of Luo's old clothes and things he had left behind. They took it all out of the apartment and they loaded it into a truck and they drove to a nearby recycling facility where they sold whatever they could and then dumped the rest, and then they left. However, when the workers at the recycling facility began processing some of the junk that had been left behind by the landlord and the brother, they made a discovery that immediately made them stop and contact the police. It would turn out Luo had not actually abandoned his apartment. In fact, he had never left his apartment. So Luo had become totally convinced that his apartment was haunted by a ghost. At night, he would hear walking around above him, even though he knew nobody actually occupied the apartment right above him. And so the footsteps didn't make any sense. And then sometimes he would claim that he would see these shadowy figures wandering around inside of his apartment. Now, it's worth noting that Luo did have mental health issues and he was a drug user, but he was absolutely adamant to the people he spoke to that there was something strange happening inside of his apartment. And so he began to wonder if, maybe somebody had been murdered in his apartment and their ghost was now haunting him. Hence the question to his landlord. And so this haunting, or whatever it was, just continued night after night, day after day for Luo, and it was driving him absolutely mad. But Luo discovered there was actually one place he could go in his apartment that would sort of protect him from whatever was happening inside of there. And that was to lock himself inside of his bedroom. However, his bedroom was not a real room. His bedroom was that big freezer the landlord found sitting in the middle of his living room. Luo had been climbing in there and shutting it to protect himself from this entity at night. But he would always prop the lid open just enough so that air could come in and out of there because it was airtight. However, shortly after Luo's conversation with his landlord about being late on rent, Luo had gone back inside his apartment, gotten really drunk, climbed inside of his bedroom, shut the lid, and forgot to prop it open. And so as he lay there, he slowly suffocated to death because there wasn't any circulation. And after he died inside of his freezer, nobody found him. And then 7 months later, after Luo's landlord and his brother emptied out Luo's apartment, they brought that freezer along with everything else to the recycling facility where the workers there would open up the freezer and they would find Luo.
At 8:30 p.m. on August 20th, 2010, a 76-year-old man named Zhang walked through the streets of New Taipei City, which is a major city in northern Taiwan. Zhang was on the end of an evening walk, and he was making his way back towards his daughter's apartment, where he was also staying. And as Zhang neared the apartment, he happened to notice there was a street lamp right outside with this big poster attached to it that he hadn't seen before. And as he got closer, he saw there was also this picture of this middle-aged woman whose name was Chen Yan Shui, and apparently she was missing. And not only that, she also lived in the same building that his daughter lived in. Except Chun was actually a dementia patient, and she was staying on the 5th floor of this apartment building complex where there was this memory care facility, and that's where she was being taken care of. And about a week earlier, she had gone out for an evening walk, this is what it said on the poster, and just not returned. And so since the week before, police had been out looking for her and her family and friends. They were putting these posters up. And it was clear, nobody had found her yet. Now, Zhang had never met this woman, but he sort of felt bad for her. And so he found himself staring at this picture and trying to memorize her face, in the off chance that he just saw her somewhere. He could report her to the authorities and hopefully get her rescued. And so after staring at the picture for a little bit longer and sort of feeling bad for this woman, Zhang turned and just continued inside the apartment building. And once he was in the apartment building, he made his way over to the elevator. He hit the up button and he waited, and then a moment later, there was a ding and the doors opened up. He stepped onto the elevator, he pressed the button, the doors closed, and then Zhang waited as he headed up to his daughter's apartment on the 7th floor. But as he was going up, he noticed he had accidentally hit the 6th floor, not the 7th floor. And right at that moment, he saw that he was reaching the 6th floor, and so the elevator car was slowing down. And so he just was like, oh, whoops, and he hit floor 7. But by the time he hit floor 7, the car had come to a stop on floor 6, and the doors were opening. Like it would need to reset. Doors open on 6, they close, and then he'd go to 7. Like this is no big deal. And so Zhang is just waiting, for these doors to open, shut, and go up one more floor. However, when the doors opened on floor 6, Zhang is looking straight out, and he could not believe what he saw, and he just began to scream. Around the same time this was happening, Zhang's daughter was finishing up her shift at work when she got a phone call. and she saw it was coming from her dad, and he rarely called her when she was at work. So this was sort of confusing and surprising, and so right away she picked it up and she answered, and immediately she hears her dad screaming incoherently. He's obviously terrified, and all Zhang's daughter can hear is that her dad is saying he's trapped in an elevator and he doesn't know what to do. And so, Zhang's daughter is getting scared just based on what her dad sounds like. She doesn't really know what's going on, but she told her dad, like, okay, I'll call the building. We'll get you some help. Like, stay calm. You're going to be okay. But her dad just continued rambling and he was totally incoherent. And eventually, Zhang's daughter just said, okay, Dad, like, just hang tight. I'm going to get you some help. And then she hung up, and then she immediately called her apartment building's administration and emergency services line and told them, hey, I think my dad is stuck on one of your elevator cars. He's really upset. Can you please help him? And after getting the emergency services to, get spun up into action to go save her dad, Zhang's daughter left work, hopped in her car, and began rushing home. It would take Zhang's daughter about 40 minutes to get back to her apartment. And by the time she got there, she fully expected her dad would be safely out of the elevator. I mean, he was obviously very upset, but she had called the building. They were on it. They were going to get him out. But when she went inside the lobby of the apartment building, she saw a crowd of police officers just standing there. She didn't see her dad anywhere. And before she could even ask any questions, she noticed one of the officers was on the phone. And clearly, just based on what was being said by this officer, he was talking to her father. Like, he was talking to somebody who was hysterical, and this officer was doing his best to try to calm him down and sort of talk him through what was happening. And so Zhang's daughter, like, immediately walks up to this officer and says, hey, I'm his daughter, the guy who's stuck in the elevator, I'm his daughter. What's going on? I would have figured he'd be out by now. Like, what's happened? At this point, one of the officers confirms that, this really is this man's daughter. And he pulls her aside and he explains to her that, yes, your dad is still in the elevator because we can't get him out. The reality is this is not a normal situation here. He's trapped in there, and really the only way for him to get out is for him to do something really specific. Like, us and the building staff, like, we can't do anything. He has to do this one really specific thing. And right now he's refusing to do it. He's too panicked, he's too scared, we're trying to calm him down, but it's not working. And so Zhang's daughter asked this officer, can you please explain to me what you're talking about? Like, what is this specific thing you want him to do? I don't get it. And at that point, the officer kind of composed himself and explained to the daughter, what was really going on inside of that elevator car. And after Zhang's daughter heard it, I mean, she was horrified, and she immediately understood why her dad was so upset and unwilling to do this one particular thing that would save him, but would be pretty awful. She got it, but she knew she would have to hop on the phone and convince her dad that he had to do it, like there was no other way. And so she walked over to the officer who was on the phone with her dad. She took the phone, and she began talking her dad through, what he really needed to do here. She basically gave him a pep talk and said, Dad, for me, you got to find the strength and do this thing and get out of there. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, the elevator doors in the lobby chimed and opened up, and Zhang came stumbling out. He looked horrible, disheveled, but he was okay. And right away, police officers rushed towards him, but they bypassed him and went into the elevator and immediately surrounded something in the elevator car. It would turn out that missing woman, Chun Yan Chui, the woman who was on that poster that Zhang saw before he walked into the apartment building, well, she really had gone missing a week earlier on her evening walk. But everybody thought she got lost while she was on that walk because she was a dementia patient, and so, she had memory issues. But the reality was, she actually did come back to her apartment. However, when she got on the elevator, she actually made the same mistake that Zhang did. Now, she was not trying to get to the 7th floor, she was trying to get to the 5th floor, but she accidentally pressed the 6th floor. So up she goes, she gets to the 6th floor, the doors open up, she steps off the elevator car, and she's immediately completely confused. And for what it's worth, it didn't matter that she had dementia. Anybody who got off on the 6th floor would likely be confused if you had never been to this building before, because the 6th floor was actually a private residence. And the person who lived on that floor was so worried about people breaking into their private residence that they had installed a metal gate in front of the elevator doors. And so unless you had the key to get through this gate, When you got off on the 6th floor, you basically would step onto a little platform that basically is the hallway leading into the 6th floor, and then you'd be hit with the gate. And so that's exactly what happened to Chun. She got off on the 6th floor, maybe thinking this is the 5th floor. She stepped onto that, little narrow strip that you could actually stand on the 6th floor before you reached the gate. And then as she was trying to figure out, like, where am I? This isn't the 5th floor. This doesn't make any sense. There's a gate in front of me. The doors to the elevator closed, and she had no way to open them up again because the buttons to access the elevator were beyond the gate. And so suddenly Chun is standing in this narrow space. The doors have closed behind her, and she can't do anything. She's trapped between the gate and the elevator doors. And even though people are using this elevator right behind her, the only person who would come to the 6th floor is the owner of that residence, and they were on vacation. And so for days and days, Chun is just trapped basically in between the gate and the elevator with no one having any idea she was there. She's calling out, she's doing everything she can to get somebody's attention, but nobody can hear her. And after 5 days of this, when the owner of this residence didn't come home because they were on vacation, she eventually died because she didn't have food or water or anything. She was just standing there for 5 days. And so she dies, and then a couple of days later, Jong accidentally rides to the 6th floor. He's like, oh shoot, I need to go to 7. He hits 7, but the doors open on 6. And when they do, Chun's body, which had been basically frozen in this standing position, fell backwards onto him, pinned him to the ground. He starts screaming and freaking out. He gets out from underneath her, but her body, which was in rigor mortis at this point, is stiff, and she was lying like a board on the ground with her feet jutting out onto the 6th floor and her upper half inside of the elevator. And so she was blocking the doors from closing. And so Jong is freaking out. He's calling his daughter. He can't believe this. There's this dead person in here. And eventually police get involved and they tell Jong, you just gotta move the body so the doors will close. But again, her body is heavy and it's stiff and she's obviously deceased. She's starting to decompose, and Jong basically couldn't handle it, and he was unwilling to move her body until his daughter hopped on the phone and said, you gotta do it. At which point he managed to lift her up, get her out of the way, and kind of push her off to the side of the elevator car. He rode down to the bottom, at which point the police came in and handled the situation. Now, the owner of the 6th floor residence was not held criminally responsible, despite putting that gate up that created this trap that killed Chun. However, despite that, he would end up paying Chun's family about $97,000 equivalent just to compensate for her death. Around 11:30 a.m. on August 14, 2005, two Greek military fighter pilots flew in their jets high above Athens, Greece, following behind a Boeing 737 commercial airplane. This commercial airplane was Helios Airways Flight 522. It had left Cyprus at 9 a.m. that morning with 121 people on board, and it was scheduled to have landed in Athens 45 minutes earlier. But instead, shortly after takeoff, Flight 522's pilots had stopped responding to air traffic control,
And now the plane was just circling right over the city. And so at some point, the military became concerned that perhaps Flight 522 had been hijacked. And at some point, the hijackers were going to crash the plane into a city. And so in response to that, they had sent up these 2 fighter pilots to see what was going on. Now, when the 2 fighter pilots arrived on station in the air right behind Flight 522, at first, they couldn't tell what the issue was. There was no fire or visible smoke or any damage to the aircraft. And so the 2 fighter pilots in tandem flew up alongside the plane so they could look inside the windows. And when they did, and they saw inside to the actual fuselage, they saw all the oxygen masks were dropped down in front of the passengers, and all the passengers had the masks on. However, all the passengers were passed out. They were slumped over with these masks strapped to their faces. Now, the fighter pilots had no idea if these passengers were unconscious or dead or some combination, but for right now, all they cared about was, are the pilots conscious and able to fly this craft? And so the 2 fighter pilots flew up until they were parallel with the cockpit, and they looked in the window, and they saw not the pilots. They saw the oxygen mask drop down, but the pilots were not there. Instead, they saw this one guy who was clearly not a pilot. He was not in a pilot's uniform, looking out the window at them, just waving, just some random guy. And so the 2 fighter pilots had no idea what to make of this. Before the fighter pilots could even begin to react to whatever was going on here, this random guy in the cockpit looked out at one of the fighter pilots and just began gesturing down with his index finger, and then a moment later, Flight 522 began to descend. To fully understand what happens next, we need to go back to just before 9 a.m. on the same morning. So 9 a.m. was takeoff, and right before, the crew of Flight 522 did their routine safety checks of the aircraft, and they determined that the craft was ready for takeoff. However, they had actually missed one crucial thing. There was a knob on this aircraft that was switched to the wrong setting by a maintenance person right before takeoff, and nobody had noticed, so it wasn't put back to where it needed to be. And so Flight 522 wound up taking off on schedule, and at first, everything was fine, totally normal. But about 2 minutes into the flight, all these alarms began sounding on the aircraft, and then the oxygen mask dropped from the ceiling. And the reason for that is that knob that had been set to the wrong setting controlled how much breathable air was in the aircraft during flight. It basically had been switched to off. So there was nothing to breathe in the airplane. And so by the time these masks were dropping down, people on the plane were already passing out, including the pilots. They were passed out pretty much immediately when those masks came down. And so it's absolutely chaos in this plane. Everybody's passing out, except for one person, 25-year-old flight attendant Andreas Prodromo, who, when the masks came down, he was awake, he was conscious, and instead of grabbing one of those masks from the overhead, he managed to connect himself to one of the emergency oxygen tanks. Now, the reason that's very important is the masks that drop down on an aircraft have a very limited supply of oxygen. But Andreas, who was actually training to be a pilot, was aware of that, and he put on this emergency oxygen tank, which had way more oxygen to it. And so suddenly he's breathing a much longer air source, and he's looking around the plane, and everybody's passed out except for him. Now, we don't know at what point he learned this, but at some point, Andreas would have noticed, as he's breathing on this emergency oxygen tank, that out the window he would see the plane is just flying in circles. And it would have dawned on him that not only are the passengers out, but very likely so are the pilots. And so literally there's nobody flying this plane. And so he had a decision to make. Either he was going to just sit here until the plane crashed, or he was going to do something, like try to fly the plane. And that's what he ultimately decided to do. And so Andreas stood up, he took his oxygen tank, and he headed into the cockpit, and after moving aside the unconscious pilots, he attempted to fly this plane. And so the 2 fighter pilots who flew up alongside the cockpit and looked in and saw that one random guy who was waving to them, that was Andreas. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Andreas was training to become a pilot, he was not remotely qualified or skilled enough to fly a big Boeing 737. He had no idea how to fly this aircraft. And making the situation even worse is very shortly after Andreas entered the cockpit, the plane ran out of fuel. And so it left its automatic holding pattern that it had been in, flying in circles, and just automatically began trying to descend. But that required pilot input to land the plane. But Andreas Andreas knew he couldn't possibly land this plane successfully. And so as the plane automatically began its descent down towards Athens, this huge city full of people, Andreas did the one thing he could do. He took one last look at one of the fighter pilots outside the window, and he gestured to them that the plane was now beginning to descend. And then Andreas, he grabbed the yoke of the aircraft, and he intentionally banked it to the left, basically flying the plane away from Athens, and he guided this plane into an unpopulated hillside where it crashed. Andreas and all 120 people on that plane all died in the crash. However, because of Andreas's heroic final act of steering the plane away from Athens, not a single person on the ground was hurt.